Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Chaplin Performance Podcast. On this particular episode, we are going to be diving into the question, is BDE the answer for resolving muscle imbalances? We'll get into that in just a second. But first, an exciting announcement. In just an hour, we'll be going live with a free presentation geared towards movement professionals as well as movement enthusiasts, where we're going to be demystifying the management of asymmetries in rehab and training. So you're not going to want to miss that. There's a couple of slots left. You can register at the link below in the description. Beyond that, we are also approaching our last couple days of the doors open for Total Body Restoration. That is my 12-week group coaching and mentorship program. There's a ton of new bonuses and goodies this time around that you are not going to want to miss. So if you want to learn how to coach and design your own posture-based and applied biomechanics program, then go ahead and join that before it's too late. So with all that being said, let's go and jump into today's topic. Is BDE the answer for resolving muscle imbalances and asymmetries? And no, I am not talking about big dick energy, although you might have some once you learn what I'm about to say with how much better you're going to be feeling and moving. But what I'm talking about is big diaphragm energy. Yes, that's right. And here we're going to talk about what the diaphragm does a little bit first, and then talk about why a lot of the diaphragm training that you might be running across in terms of asymmetry management type approaches might be missing the mark and what to do instead. So let's kind of jump in here. So first of all, the diaphragm, we know that it's the primary muscle of respiration. When we take a breath in, that diaphragm moves down, and then when we take a breath out, it returns to its more relaxed, domed position. So we know that there's a breathing function here. We even have kind of a funky saying for the innervation or the nerve supply to the diaphragm, which is phrenic nerve 3, 4, 5 keeps us alive. Because if the diaphragm stops working, well, so do we, right? So we need it to help us provide oxygen throughout the body, but we also have another important function that from a movement perspective is probably even more important, and that is that it helps us control balance. So I have a question for you to think about. If you've ever heard of the compression and expansion model, you'll know that compression is movement that squeezes and creates force, and expansion is movement that creates and allows space. So is the diaphragm an expansion-based or a compression-based muscle? Well, the answer here is actually both, because it helps us to expand the chest, which then gives us this gradient of expansion to then compress against, which is great. And it also increases the pressure in the abdomen. Now, how does that work? When we take our breath in, the diaphragm actually moves down. And what it's doing when it moves down is it's pushing everything below it downwards a bit. So if we think of our guts below the diaphragm, they get pushed down every time we take a breath in. And if we have coordinated movement of the abdominals and the back muscles and our pelvic floor muscles, that all creates this canister that gets pressurized when we take our breath in. Now, our breath in isn't the only time this happens, because the diaphragm also has a postural role. Now, as you can see here, it not only expands the chest, right, which creates a gradient for movement, but it also pushes down into the abdomen here and creates pressure, which gives us stability. So the diaphragm, or the hemidiaphragm, half of the diaphragm on each side, allows us to create stability on that side at the time of movement. And so what happens is the diaphragm, along with the abs, the back muscles, and the pelvic floor, all contract in a coordinated fashion to help us stabilize the body in anticipation of movement. So let's say I go to reach out to move something, that diaphragm contracts, creates a little bit of compression there in the abdomen, and helps us to balance. So I will link a article here below that talks about how muscle diaphragm or diaphragm muscle thickness here actually is going to correlate to measures of balance, right? So what does this have to do with muscle imbalance? Well, it turns out that muscles are, in many cases, if not in most cases, responding to the position of the body and the shape of the body. So if we think about the rib cage, we can have a position in space where we're moving it forward, backward, left, right, turn to the right, turn to the left. And we can have shape changes that happen there as well. So if we have certain compressive strategies. We might get the rib cage to get a little bit more thin front to back, for example, and a little bit wider side to side. Or we could have just the opposite. And sometimes we can have differences in that on one or both sides. Now, what are those differences responding to? Because those differences are what's going to actually give us this feeling of having a muscle imbalance. So what's the underlying cause of those changes in shape and changes in position? Well, it turns out that one of the most important is going to be the function of the diaphragm as it relates to its function as a postural balance and pre-activation stabilization-based muscle. So in a lot of the training these days that you're going to see online with respect to the diaphragm, we talk a lot about getting a nice full exhale to relax the diaphragm. And this is a really good idea because what it does is it allows that diaphragm to come up. And when it comes up, then we can position the abdominals in a good position to be able to co-contract it with the diaphragm to be able to create some stability. So we love this recommendation. But if you look at the article that I linked, they looked at diaphragm thickness, which is a measure of how strong and how well that diaphragm is moving on our ability to balance ourselves. Doing low-level breathing exercises that focus on relaxation first and then subsequent gentle co-activation probably isn't going to be enough of a stimulus to create an increase in thickness. Now, there are some articles out there that show that stabilization-based exercises, such as core exercises, can increase the stiffness of, the thickness of the diaphragm. But there's also research that looks at the effect of other activities, which in my opinion are far more scalable and progressible that also cause an increase in this thickness. And the interesting thing here is that I'm going to go through a couple of activities here, which in my experience were so beneficial for me, although I didn't understand the reason at that point in time. And I'm going to give you some real concrete recommendations of how you can integrate some cues here and some things to think about with respect to progressing these activities as well as performing them. So again, we go back to this thought of the diaphragm as a muscle that can create compression within the abdomen. Awesome. So we can train it in that function by doing things that require us to create that compression. What are examples of that? So a great example of that could be something like a heavy squat or a heavy deadlift or even a jump of some sort. Those are going to cause us to have to stabilize that side of the body or both sides of the body. And so when we're doing our lifting, simply integrating cues such as a full exhale to get all that air out of the lungs, relax the diaphragm, engage the deeper abs, then followed by an inhale, really feeling the abs staying engaged, creating an oppositional force to the diaphragm, and then inhaling down and feeling that diaphragm pushing down so that we're about 3/4 of the way full with air in the lungs. That's going to be a great way to set up for our heavier squats and our heavier deadlifts. And we're going to start to train the function of that diaphragm in that context. Now, if we then take that to more unilateral activities or staggered and split stance type activities, we can bias one side versus the other. Now, when we do our full exhale, we're going to relax the diaphragm. Let's say we're doing a split squat or a staggered kind of variation. If we're loading primarily on one leg and we fully exhale, what we're doing is we're letting the diaphragm come up, which makes room for the guts to go over in that direction. If we can engage the abdominals slightly on that side and then take our breath in so that diaphragm pushes down, then we're going to stabilize that side. And from there, creating a nice canister of ribcage and pelvis stacking over each other with that equal compression, we can then move straight up and down as in a squat or hinge back and forth as in a hinge. So that's going to be a great cue for you to integrate, but you might be wondering, okay, how do I get a feel for that? So one of the things that we were talking about here in terms of the issue that the current training of the diaphragm has is that we don't scale it up enough. So obviously weightlifting is infinitely scalable if we can take that cue that I just gave you and then integrate it into those activities, then we're going to be able to increase that thickness over time. But what happens if we need to take a little bit of a step back and improve our awareness of how that diaphragm is moving first, so that we can later integrate it into something that's a bit more scalable? And this is where I think we have really missed the mark, because you'll see a lot of popular approaches talking about the use of exhalation-based resistance to help to cue a little bit more of abdominal engagement and a little bit more of diaphragm relaxation. You'll also see us talk about various exhalation strategies to try to either increase or reduce superficial muscle activity. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these models have a strong bias towards the assumption that all of our diaphragms are already pushing down too much and that we are already too hyperinflated, and they seem to bias exhalation as the highest priority. Now, there's going to be a number of theoretical reasons for why this could be the case, right? Gravity is already pushing us down. Maybe we're having trouble managing that. So doesn't it make sense to try to get that diaphragm to come up to reduce the downward pressure? Well, sure, that's one interpretation. But another one is that if we are able to increase the strength of the diaphragm, that's also going to cue co-contraction from the pelvic floor, from the abdominals, from those deeper muscles like the multifidus, for example, and create a 360-degree compression-based canister that is actually going to carry over a lot better into some of our other more scalable training activities, which have the ability to create adaptations which become the tide that raises all ships, right? If we get stronger and we get more endurance, for example, through progressive training, well, then the diaphragm is going to be more efficient at working and it won't have to work quite as hard. So given a tendency of position or length tension, if it's stronger and it has more endurance, then it's probably going to perform better, just like any other skeletal muscle. So now we have the question of entry point. And just as we would use a balloon or a kazoo or a pursed lips strategy to provide a little resistance to act as a cue to relax that diaphragm, we can use something here that is the opposite end of the spectrum, but a little bit different. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, what I'm holding in my hand is an inspiratory muscle trainer. And if you're watching the video, this is what it looks like here. And so what this is it's essentially a little cylinder of sorts that you put in your mouth, and then there's an attachment here where you can adjust the degree of openness there. And so obviously the smaller the hole there, the more resistance you'll get. And you can put this in your mouth here and then breathe in through your mouth with the feeling of trying to feel that diaphragm pushing down without engaging the neck or lifting the shoulders to do it. And that's a great place to get started. Now, what I will say here is that I still think there's value in creating an oppositional force to this inhalation. So I think we can still exhale long and get that diaphragm to relax a little bit, get those abs to come in. And then when we go to breathe in, let's keep a little bit of that abdominal tension in there and then use this resistance to get that diaphragm to push down a little bit harder. This is going to be a great way to contract the diaphragm into its more shortened position. Now, a little bit of nuance. How do we feel the diaphragm? This is something I dive deeper in inside my program, Total Body Restoration. So if you want all the cues here, then definitely go ahead and join that. The doors are open for another 2 days. So go ahead and check that out. But one thing we must understand about feeling the diaphragm is that we either feel it by proxy with increased abdominal tension, or we feel expansion at the bottom of the rib cage, or we feel it directly. And this is going to be something that requires us to ask a question. How is the diaphragm innervated? What nerves, from a sensory perspective, give us that feedback of its movement, right, of its tension? And it turns out that the vast majority of the sensory innervation to the diaphragm is going to be coming into what's called the crural portion. So if we look at the diaphragm, in the ribs, we have, or in the rib cage, we have parts that attach to the rib. Those are the costal parts. And then we have the parts that attach to the spine. Those are the crural parts, or the crura. And the left and the right are slightly different there on either side. But we can think of those as interior muscles that are fascially connected to the psoas and the iliacus. And they help to create a position of extension or posterior compression, we can think of in terms of a movement, even though they are interior. So those muscles, when they are in their concentric or shortened state, are going to tend to produce more extension. So a lot of the methods out there look at reducing this influence of the crural portion of that diaphragm and getting us to relax out of this extension pattern. My contention here is that for many people, if we're dealing with a diaphragm that is not working adequately, that is too weak, let's say there's some sort of irritation of the cervical nerve roots, for example, that could be one possible scenario, or there's a history of thoracic surgery there, or any number of scenarios, maybe just habitual positioning. We could have an actual weakening of that diaphragm and a reduced mind-muscle connection. Just like you have a reduced mind-muscle connection to your bicep. I can't feel it when I'm doing bicep curls. Well, when we do inhalation, can we feel the diaphragm? And if that crural portion is where we feel most of that innervation, what we might actually want to do is bias extension in our positioning to be able to feel that from the interior, pulling forward a little bit on that segment. So if we have a side, for example, that we are having trouble creating a little bit of compression in the back and compression in the front to thin that rib cage out front to back and expand it side to side, then an extended position is probably best. To create that, a simple thing we could do is get into an all fours or prone position and start to push that rib cage back a little bit while simultaneously thinking at that level of the lower rib cage here, just pulling those vertebrae forward from the inside on that interior crural attachment. Then once we get that, we can bring in, again, our inspiratory muscle training device and work on inhaling, feeling that diaphragm come down, maybe now with a little bit more sensory input on that crural portion. Now, in terms of asymmetry, there's an application here as well. So let's say we're someone who is compressed front to back on the right side, but expanded front to back on the left. What we would have in this case would we tend to have a spine that's actually turning back towards the left. Now, in order to get that to turn back towards the right, what we would want to do is pull the vertebrae forward on the left. We'd want to squeeze that left side and then allow fluid to flow over towards that right side. In this case, we have anterior-posterior compression to start on the right and anterior-posterior expansion on the left. We probably want to reverse this in this case. And once again, this would be a great reason to get some concentric orientation of that crural part of the diaphragm on that left side with co-contraction of your psoas, abdominals, iliacus, etc., to begin to create the compressive strategy on the left that then shifts us over to the right. So in this case, we could produce right rotation, emphasizing the extension or pulling forward of that left side. Then we produce the inhalation with or without resistance on the left to help us push fluid flow over towards the right and create the compressive strategy on the left that allows the right to assume the expansive strategy. So hopefully here you've got some kind of concrete recommendations in terms of what to actually do from a positional standpoint, some different ideas. Now, in terms of the modalities that I think are going to be the most powerful for being able to progress these baseline skills, I think now we come to things that are energy system development type skills to work on the conditioning side. So do we have the right oxidative capacity? Do we have the ability to use glucose as a fuel source when we get into a little bit higher intensities? And then weightlifting as well. So can we increase pressure and maintain it through a moderate rep range of, let's say, 10 to 30 reps? Or can we increase it maximally and be able to use that to create pressure in a rep range of, let's say, from 0 to 5 reps with much heavier loads? Then can we also do things that increase power development over time, either allowing us to be able to explosively coordinate the diaphragm in combination with those other muscles, such as in power exercises? Or can we do jumping type exercises to be able to ascend the pelvic floor and diaphragm together, and potentially we use that newfound thickness and control of the diaphragm under these circumstances to control how quickly each side is coming up. And then obviously we have the opposite end of that spectrum in terms of being able to relax the diaphragm and concentrically orient the pelvic floor to kind of bounce the guts up. So in terms of long-term training, I think a balanced program looks like some form of lifting, some form of progressive conditioning, some form of isolating these key skills if needed, and then some sort of power training that has an element of symmetrical stances as well as asymmetrical stances as well. So hopefully, after listening to this, you have an idea of opening your mind a little bit to look at the common ways that we approach training the diaphragm and expand this out a little bit, understanding that we can have an influence of many different underlying conditions and tendencies, and we need a little bit more of an open model to be able to address this. So if you want to dive deeper into expanding your conception of how to deal with asymmetry and training and get a little bit more access to different tools in your toolbox, then go ahead and sign up for Total Body Restoration. Again, enrollment is open for the next couple of days. If you want to learn a little bit more about my method overall, make sure you sign up for that live event. We're going to be live here in less than an hour. And if you were just listening to this and enjoying it and made it all the way to the end, then you are definitely the real MVP. As always, thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode on the webinar or in Total Body Restoration. As always, peace.